Now let's look at how we measure inflation. So real GDP was all about taking out inflation, but how do we figure out how much inflation there is to start with? Well, there are two ways to measure inflation. One is called the GDP Deflator, and one uses a price index like the Consumer Price Index. So let's look at each of these and how we would calculate them. The GDP Deflator takes nominal GDP and divides by real GDP. So if you recall, in our pizza and calzones example, we found that nominal GDP for 2016 was 420. And we found the real GDP for 2016 was 350. So we can calculate the GDP deflator by taking 420, dividing by 350, and we multiply times 100 to get our GDP deflator. So 420 divided by 350 times 100 is 120. What this tells you is that there has been 20% inflation since the base year. The base year will always have a GDP deflator of 100 because in the base year, so if we take nominal GDP for 2007, the nominal GDP for 2007 was 175. And the real GDP for 2007. Well, we didn't find that before, but we could find that now. A real GDP for 2007 would use the quantities in 2007 and the prices in 2007. Well, notice if we use the quantities of 2007 and the prices of the base year, 2007, we've just calculated the nominal GDP of 2007. So in the base year, the nominal GDP and the real GDP are the same, which means the GDP deflator is 175 divided by 175 times 100, or just 100. So your GDP deflator in the base year will always be 100, which means when you find the GDP deflator for any other year, you can compare it to 100 by looking at how much bigger the number is compared to 100. So in this case, 120 compared to 100, 20 bigger, so prices have increased 20%. If the GDP deflator was 80, we compare that to the base of 100, then that means prices have fallen by 20%. So we're comparing it to 100. If it's higher than 100, we've had inflation. If it's lower than 100, we've had deflation. How much it is more or less than 100 will tell you how much the price has changed. So the GDP deflator is one way to see how much inflation we've had. The second method for finding inflation is to use a price index. A price index is a bundle of goods and services, and we typically use the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index looks at what goods and services the typical Canadian consumes. And on Blackboard you can actually see the list of goods and services that are included in CPI. So let's actually just bring that up here. So you'll see this sheet on Blackboard, and what it shows you is the weightings for different provinces in terms of the typical Canadian, how much they spend on things like meat and dairy. And so you can see in that bundle of goods, there's everything from paying taxis and parking fees to buying meat. We can look at healthcare, we can look at alcohol, traveling. So it's the bundle of goods and services the typical Canadian buys. When we look at this bundle of goods, we can then look at the prices of each of these and see how they change over time. And that's what the consumer price index is. It takes those bundle of goods and it looks at what happens to those prices. So for your own interest, take a look at those weightings and see how does that compare to how much you spent. What percentage of your budget is food compared to the typical Canadian, according to the Consumer Price Index? Well, if we were to calculate the Consumer Price Index, we need a formula. So let's create that. So to find CPI, let's get out of red here. Let's get back to our black pen. To find CPI, we need to find the cost of our market basket of goods in the current year and divide it by the cost of that market basket, but priced in the base year. And then we multiply that times 100 to turn it into our index. So let's assume in our previous example that the average Canadian, or whoever's living in our pizza and calzones economy, that the average consumer gets 2 calzones and 2 pizzas. To find CPI, we would find the value of 2 calzones and 2 pizzas in the current year, so in 2016, and we would compare that to 2 pizzas and 2 calzones in 2007. Okay, so let's do that. Well, if we remember, let's go think back here to the prices of pizzas and calzones. So in 2016, the price of a calzone was $12, and the price of a pizza, I think that was the pizza that was $12. Let's try this again. Pizza was $12, and the calzone was $6. In 2007, the calzone was $5, and the pizza was $10. So to find the cost of our market basket in the current year, we're going to take our 2 calzones times $6 a piece, plus our 2 pizzas times $12 a piece. So the total value of that market basket of goods, well, 2 times 6 plus 2 times 12, and what we end up with is 36. Well, what about in 2007? Again, 2 calzones, but this time at a price of $5 a piece, and 2 pizzas, this time at a price of $10 a piece. So 2 times 5 plus 2 times 10, and we get 30. To find the consumer price index, we take that 2016 market basket of goods, so 36, and we divide by the 2007 basket of goods here, which is 30. We multiply times 100, and we get 120. Now this 120 tells us there's been 20% inflation since the base year. And that's because in the base year, your current prices and your base year prices will be the same. And so you're dividing the same number by each other, and so you get 100. So when you get a CPI that's over 100, you've had inflation. And if you get a CPI that's less than 100, you've had deflation. So if we had a CPI of 80, there's been 20% deflation, prices have fallen. With a CPI of 120, we've had 20% inflation. And it's always since the base year. Now, if we're to compare CPI and the GDP deflator, the question is, are they the same thing? In this example, we found they gave us the same number. Both of them told us there was 20% inflation since the base year. But in real life, they're not going to give you the same number. Let's see if we can't get our slides to come back and focus. But the GDP deflator and the consumer price index, they don't tell you about the same thing. They have different things that are in them. So we need to know what's in the GDP deflator and what's in CPI in order to know what is actually seeing inflation or deflation. So pardon the scrolling. The app I'm using seems to have lots of technical difficulties. But let's compare the GDP deflator and CPI. The GDP deflator is based on GDP. So what is the expenditure approach to GDP? What's the formula for GDP? Hopefully you remember. It is C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. So remember, gross domestic product comes from spending by households, businesses, government, people in other countries. And then we have to subtract all the spending that households and businesses and the government does buying from other countries. So we subtract out the imports. So what that means then is that the GDP deflator, because it includes spending by the government and by businesses, it includes capital goods. Okay. The consumer price index, remember this is the bundle of goods that the typical consumer buys. It's just going to be consumption spending. Okay. Now the GDP deflator, we subtracted out the import spending because we're looking at just spending on the goods and services in our economy. The consumer price index is anything that households buy. So it includes imports, which is why when the U.S. sees inflation, we see inflation because households buy goods and services that are produced in the U.S. Other differences between the GDP deflator and CPI is that CPI is a bundle of goods, so it doesn't seem to change from year to year. It completely ignores the fact that we might substitute a different good if something becomes more expensive. And there's other goods that we buy that take a while to get added to that bundle of goods. So for example, it's not updated every year. So when Blu-ray players got added, when iPads, those were added multiple years after consumers started buying them. So it takes a while to update it. So it's really the same goods every year. There's not a whole lot of substitution or changes. The GDP deflator, on the other hand, is actually what we actually buy. And so it can be completely different goods every year. It allows for substitution. If we normally buy a TV to watch our favorite shows and TVs have gotten too expensive, then households might switch to more buying iPads, laptops, computers to watch their shows on, and the GDP deflator would take this into account because it's changing the goods. The CPI would not. So GDP deflator is not the same goods every year. The CPI is. Okay, so as we compare the two, they're different goods. Capital goods are in the GDP deflator, not in CPI. CPI has imports, and CPI is the same goods year after year. Once you have calculated CPI, or the GDP deflator, you can then calculate inflation by looking at how the CPI or GDP deflator change from year to year. So to find the inflation rate, we essentially take the new number minus the old number divided by the old number times 100. So let's look at the consumer price index for Canada. Okay, so we'll just pull that up on the screen here. So consumer price index, and we're looking at all items. You can actually look at individual categories and look at how their prices change, but we're going to look at CPI and we're going to look at it for Canada. Okay, notice here you can also find CPIs for the different provinces. So notice in August 2016, the CPI was 128.7. And in August 2017, it was 130.5. So let's just capture those numbers down. Let's go back to our notes here. All right, so to find the inflation rate for Canada, we're going to take the new number, which was 130.5, subtract the old number, 128.7, and divide by the old number, 128.7, and multiply that times 100. So we do that calculation, 130.5 minus 128.7, that's 1.8 divided by 128.7. Okay, we multiply that times 100, and we get 1.3986 and so on. So if we round that to 2 decimals, 1.40. So what this is telling us is from August 2016 to August 2017, prices in Canada have increased 1.4%. Now we use this calculation to calculate the inflation rate because we want to compare 2 years and one of them is not the base year. When we found the CPI before, it compared to the base year. So if you find a CPI of 130.5, it means there's been 30.5% inflation since the base year. The CPI of 128.7 means there's been 28.7% inflation since the base year. To compare the two and find out how much inflation between the two, we use this calculation. On Blackboard, for your challenge, you're going to find an inflation rate for Canada, compare it to Alberta, and compare it to the US. So you just want to make sure you're comparing the same period of time. All right, so this is based on CPI. What about the inflation rate based on the GDP deflator? Well, to find the GDP deflator, we can go online. And a great source for finding GDP deflators for countries is Trading Economics. And so what you see here is the Canada GDP deflators. So we see that this summer, the GDP deflator was 115. And if we go back and look at last summer, it was 112.2. So let's do the inflation rate calculation based on the GDP deflator. Let's go back. So based on the GDP deflator, again, we take new minus old divided by old. And this time we have, for our 2017, we have 115. And for 2016, we have 112.2. Okay. So to find inflation, we take 115, that's the new, minus 112.2, that's the old, divided by 112.2, which is the old, times 100. So we do that calculation. 115 minus 112.2, divided all by the old number, multiply times 100. And what you find there is the amount of inflation is 2.4955 and so on, so 2.5% inflation. So notice the inflation rate in the last year based on the GDP deflator is 2.5%. Based on CPI, it's 1.4%. So what does this tell us about what prices are changing in our economy? It tells us that capital goods, that's what businesses and government buys, has been increasing in price more than the goods that households buy. It's also possible that we are seeing less inflation coming from imports from foreign countries, and that's why the CPI inflation rate is less than the GDP deflator. We can look at where the sources of inflation are. So this graph here looks at sources of inflation. It actually comes from the Statistics Canada website. So I'll actually just show you where you can find that. So if we go to the main page of the Statistics Canada website, you can click here where it says Consumer Price Index. And as you scroll down, you'll see chart 2 on the right, and that will show you the different areas that households spend their money and whether it's seeing inflation, so to the right, or deflation to the left. That same location, you can get additional information about provinces, which ones are seeing the most inflation, and in fact you can go down here and look at the CPI for the different provinces or for different types of goods and services. So let's go back to our slides. And here we can see inflation by category. And so we can look for August 2017 and determine which goods and services have seen the most increase in prices. So transportation, gas prices have been up, as well as alcohol and tobacco products, and primarily because a number of provinces have been adding taxes to those two areas. We can look at inflation over time. So this graph here shows you the CPI for Canada back to 1915. And you can see impacts of the Great Depression, for example. That's right here. We can see that period of stagflation in the 70s. So that's inflation that you're seeing here. The early ones that you see on the far left of the graph, that's a bit of an anomaly. And that has to do with us changing how we've pegged our currency, because we used to be on the gold standard. So if you ignore those kind of spikes on the left, that's what those are. Now notice though, since 1991, what's been happening with our inflation? Well, since 1991, the Bank of Canada has made it a priority to keep inflation between 1% and 3%. And you can see how well that's been working in Canada.